The warehouse in Red Hook smelled of old fish and older secrets, its cavernous interior lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in sickly yellow shadows. 5 families had gathered around a table that had seen more blood than most battlefields, their representatives sitting with the careful distance of predators forced to share territory. I stood behind Don Vincent Torino's chair, my hands clasped behind my back, my expression blank as concrete. To everyone in that room, I was nothing more than muscle with a driver's license. Tony Marcelli, the Don's regular driver and bodyguard, 28 years old, quiet, unremarkable, useful for fetching coffee and intimidating shop owners who forgot their protection payments. They had no idea who I really was. And that was exactly how I wanted it. "Gentlemen," said Don Salvatore Benedetto, the eldest of the 5 bosses and the unofficial chairman of these monthly meetings, "we have business to discuss. The waterfront situation has become complicated. I'd been driving for Don Torino for 3 years, ever since I'd arrived in Brooklyn with nothing but a suitcase and a burning need to disappear from my old life. In that time, I'd learned to make myself invisible, to blend into the background so completely that powerful men forgot I had ears, forgot I had a brain, forgot I was anything more than a convenient piece of furniture that happened to be able to drive a car and break kneecaps when necessary. It was the perfect cover for someone who needed to remain dead to the world. The Colombians are moving. Product through our docks without permission," continued Don Benedetto, his weathered face grim with the weight of territorial disputes that could turn bloody without warning. "They're offering better terms to our dock workers, undermining our control." "Let me handle it," growled Don Carmine Rossi, his thick fingers drumming against the scarred table. "A few examples made, a few bodies floating in the harbor, and they'll remember whose territory they're trespassing on. Violence brings attention," observed Don Michael Castellano, the youngest of the bosses at 42. "Federal attention. We need a more subtle approach." "Subtle won't keep our people in line," Don Rossi shot back. "Respect comes from fear, and fear comes from consequences." Don Torino, my boss, had remained quiet during this exchange, his dark eyes calculating as he listened to his peers debate strategy. At 55, Vincent Torino was smarter than most people gave him credit for, but he lacked the vision to see beyond traditional solutions to modern problems. "What we need," Don Torino said finally, "is information. We need to know who's backing the Colombians, what their real objectives are, how much money they're willing to lose to establish a foothold. Information costs money," said Don Paolo Marconi, the most cautious of the 5 leaders. "And informants have a tendency to tell people what they think those people want to hear." "Not informants," Don Torino replied. "Documentation, paper trails, financial records, the kind of evidence that doesn't lie." Don Benedetto's eyes sharpened with interest. "You have access to such documentation?" "I'm working on it. Give me 2 weeks, and I'll have enough information to make informed decisions about how to handle this situation." I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was calculating. 2 weeks to gather intelligence on a Colombian operation that was almost certainly backed by people with government connections, military training, and resources that dwarfed anything the 5 families could bring to bear. Don Torino was walking into a war he didn't understand against an enemy he had never faced. 2 weeks, agreed Don Benedetto. "But Vincent, understand this. If you can't deliver actionable intelligence, we move forward with Carmine's approach. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work." After the meeting ended and the other bosses had departed with their respective entourages, Don Torino settled into the passenger seat of his black Cadillac, with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had bought himself time and positioned himself advantageously. "Tony," he said as I started the engine, "I need you to do something for me." "Of course." "Don Torino, I want you to start hanging around the docks more. Keep your ears open, your eyes sharp. These Colombians, they're not ghosts. They have to be meeting with people, paying people, coordinating with someone local. You want me to gather intelligence? I want you to be my eyes and ears down there. You're good at being invisible, Tony. People don't notice drivers, don't think we're important enough to watch what we say around. Use that, I nodded, already knowing that what Don Torino was asking for was impossible through casual observation. The Colombian operation was too sophisticated, too well organized, too careful to leave the kind of evidence lying around where a curious driver might stumble across it. But I also knew something that Don Torino didn't. I knew exactly how to get the information he needed. Because I had spent the last 3 years not just driving him around Brooklyn, but building a network of contacts and resources that reached far beyond anything the 5 families imagined possible. Don Torino, I said carefully, what if I could get you more than just street-level intelligence? What if I could get you financial records, shipping manifests, communication intercepts? Don Torino turned to look at me with the expression of a man who had just heard his dog start speaking Latin. Tony, you're a driver. A good driver, don't get me wrong, but let's not pretend you're some kind of spy. Leave the complicated stuff to people who understand how these things work. Of course, sir. I just thought, don't think, Tony. Drive, watch, listen, report back to me what you see and hear. And let me worry about the analysis. I drove him home in silence, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind racing with possibilities. For 3 years, I had played the role of loyal driver, competent muscle, faithful servant to a man who saw me as useful but unremarkable. I had built my cover so well that even I sometimes forgot who I really was beneath the facade. But the Colombian situation was different. This wasn't about territory disputes or protection rackets or the usual petty conflicts that defined organized crime in Brooklyn. This was about something much larger, much more dangerous. Something that connected to networks and organizations that could destroy the 5 families without breaking a sweat. And I was probably the only person in that warehouse who understood just how serious the threat really was. That night, I sat in my small apartment above a bakery in Bensonhurst, staring at a secure satellite phone that I hadn't used in 6 months. Making this call would change everything. It would mean stepping out of the shadows I had cultivated so carefully, revealing capabilities that would raise questions I wasn't prepared to answer. But it would also mean protecting people who had become, against all my expectations, something resembling family. I dialed the number from memory, listening to the sequence of clicks and electronic tones that meant I was being connected to people who officially didn't exist. Control, came the voice on the other end, synthesized and anonymous. Phoenix requesting operational support, I said, using the code name I hadn't spoken aloud in 3 years. Phoenix, you've been classified as deep cover inactive. What's your situation? Local organized crime families are about to stumble into something that will get them all killed. I need intelligence on Colombian operations in the New York Harbor area, specifically financial backing and political connections. That's outside your current operational parameters. Then change my operational parameters. These people are walking into a meat grinder, and they don't even know it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Phoenix, are you compromised? Has your emotional attachment to your cover identity affected your judgment? I thought about Don Torino's trust, about the 3 years I had spent learning to care about people I was supposed to be using, about the fact that I was no longer sure where Tony Marcelli, the loyal driver, ended and the person I used to be began. Maybe, I said finally, but I'm also right about the threat assessment. Send me what I need and I'll handle the rest. Understood. Package will be delivered through usual channels within 48 hours. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the weight of decisions I had never expected to have to make. In 2 days, I would have everything I needed to save Don Torino and his fellow bosses from their own ignorance. But using that information would mean revealing that Tony the driver was someone else entirely. Someone with connections and capabilities that existed far outside the world they thought they controlled. The question was whether they would thank me for saving their lives, or kill me for lying to them for 3 years. The package arrived exactly 48 hours later, delivered by a courier who looked like every other bike messenger in Brooklyn, but moved with the precise efficiency of someone trained to kill with their bare hands. Inside the manila envelope were documents that would have made Don Torino's head spin if he had possessed the background to understand what he was looking at. Financial records showing wire transfers from accounts in 7 different countries. Shipping manifests for cargo containers that officially contained coffee beans, but actually carried enough weapons to outfit a small army. Communication intercepts revealing that the Colombian businessmen weren't civilians at all, but former military officers working for a cartel with connections to intelligence services in 3 different hemispheres. Most importantly, there were photographs, surveillance shots of meetings between the Colombian representatives and people I recognized from the federal building downtown. People who wore expensive suits and carried badges that opened doors the 5 families could never even approach. This wasn't a simple territorial dispute over dock access. This was a carefully orchestrated operation designed to use organized crime as cover for something much larger and much more dangerous. I spent the next day making my usual rounds with Don Torino, driving him to his restaurant, his social club, his various business appointments. All the while, I was calculating how to present information that would save his life without revealing how I had obtained it. "Tony," he said, as we sat outside a building where he was meeting with his accountant, "have you learned anything useful down at the docks?" "Some things, Don Torino. The Colombians are more organized than people think. Better funded, better connected." "What kind of connections?" I chose my words carefully. "The kind that make this situation more complicated than a simple turf war." Don Torino studied my face in the rearview mirror. "You're talking in riddles, Tony. What aren't you telling me?" "I'm telling you that maybe the 5 families should consider cooperation instead of confrontation with these people. At least until we understand what we're really dealing with, cooperation." His voice carried the incredulous tone of a man who had never backed down from a fight in his life. "Tony, these people are stealing from us. They're undermining our authority, disrespecting our territory. You want us to roll over and play dead? I want you to stay alive long enough to understand what you're fighting." The conversation was interrupted by Don Torino's accountant emerging from the building, his face pale with the kind of worry that meant either the IRS had called or someone had died. Don Torino rolled down his window. "What's wrong, Eddie?" "Boss, we got problems. Big problems. The feds raided 3 of Carmine's operations this morning. Seized records, froze accounts, arrested 2 of his lieutenants." Don Torino's face went gray. "How did they know where to look?" "Someone's been feeding them information. Detailed information, the kind that only comes from inside knowledge." As we drove away from the building, I could see Don Torino's mind working through the implications. A federal investigation meant wiretaps, surveillance, infiltration. It meant that someone in the organization was talking, and it meant that the comfortable world of handshake agreements and understood boundaries was about to collapse. "Tony," he said quietly, "I need you to set up a meeting. All 5 bosses, tonight." "Where?" "The old Benedetto place in Staten Island, the one that's been empty since the fire. Tell them it's urgent." That evening I drove through rain that turned the city into a noir movie, all shadows and reflected light and the promise of violence lurking around every corner. The abandoned Benedetto estate sat on a hill overlooking the harbor, its windows dark, its grounds overgrown with weeds that whispered secrets in the wind. Inside, the 5 bosses had gathered in what had once been a grand ballroom, now empty, except for a folding table and 5 chairs that looked like props from a low-budget gangster film. I stood by the door, hands clasped behind my back, playing my role as faithful driver and bodyguard while listening to men who controlled millions of dollars and hundreds of lives try to understand why their world was falling. "But 3 operations raided simultaneously," Don Torino was saying. "That's not luck. That's not coincidence. Someone with detailed knowledge of Carmine's business gave the feds everything they needed." "You think we have an informant?" asked Don Benedetto. "I think we have something worse. I think we have someone working for the government who's been playing a very long game." Don Rossi slammed his fist on the table. "Impossible. We know everyone who works for us. We know their families, their histories, their loyalties. Do we?" Don Torino looked around the table at his fellow bosses. "Gentlemen, I'm beginning to think we've been outplayed by people who are smarter than us, better funded than us, and playing by rules we don't even understand." "What are you suggesting?" asked Don Castellano. "I'm suggesting that these Colombians aren't what they appear to be. I'm suggesting that this whole situation has been engineered to force us into making mistakes that give the government everything it needs to destroy us." The room fell, silent except for the sound of rain against broken windows and the distant whistle of ships in the harbor. These were men who had built their power on understanding their enemies, on calculating risks and rewards with precision. But they were facing something outside their experience, something that operated according to rules they had never learned. "Vincent," said Don Benedetto finally, "you said you could get intelligence on the Colombian operation. What have you learned?" Don Torino glanced at me, then back at the other bosses. "I've learned that we're in over our heads. I've learned that this isn't about dock access or territory. I've learned that we need to be very, very careful about our next moves. That's not intelligence, Vincent. That's paranoia, is it? Tell that to Carmine's lieutenants who are sitting in federal holding cells right now." Don Rossi leaned forward aggressively. "So what do you suggest we do? Roll over? Give up? Let these Colombians walk all over us? I suggest we get better information before we make any moves that can't be taken back. And how do you propose we do that?" Don Torino looked directly at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood go cold. Suspicion, calculation, the look of a man who had started connecting dots in ways I hadn't anticipated. "Tony," he said quietly, "tell these gentlemen what you told me about the Colombians having connections." Every person in the room turned to look at me. 5 of the most dangerous men in New York waiting for their driver to share his insights into a situation that was spiraling beyond their control. I realized in that moment that my cover was about to be blown, whether I wanted it to be or not. Don Torino suspected something, and his suspicions were pushing him toward questions I couldn't answer without revealing everything. "Don Torino," I said carefully, "I think there are things about this situation that are bigger than what we can see from street level." "What kind of things?" "The kind of things that require a different approach than the traditional methods." "Tony," said Don Benedetto, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience, "you're just a driver. What could you possibly know about intelligence gathering or federal investigations?" I looked around the room at 5 men who were about to make decisions that would get them all killed, and realized that I had reached the moment I had been dreading for 3 years. It was time to stop being Tony Marcelli, the driver, and start being someone who might be able to save their lives. "With respect, Don Benedetto," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket, "I think you might be surprised by what drivers know when they're the right kind of drivers." I pulled out the manila envelope containing documents that would change everything, and placed it on the table in the center of the room. "These are the real papers, gentlemen, and after you read them, I think you'll understand why your Colombian problem is about to become something much worse." The silence in the abandoned ballroom stretched like a held breath as 5 of New York's most powerful crime bosses stared at the manila envelope I had placed on the table. The rain continued to drum against the broken windows, and somewhere in the distance, a foghorn moaned across the harbor like a warning from the dead. "Open it," Don Benedetto said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had survived 6 decades in a world where information was the difference between power and a shallow grave. Don Torino reached for the envelope, his movements careful and deliberate. As he pulled out the first set of documents, his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something approaching horror. "Financial records," he said quietly, scanning pages of bank transfers and wire receipts. "Jesus Christ, Tony, where did you get these?" "Keep reading," I said, my voice steady, despite the fact that I was about to burn down 3 years of carefully constructed cover identity. It gets worse. Don Rossi leaned over to look at the documents, his thick fingers tracing columns of numbers that represented millions of dollars moving through offshore accounts. These are internal banking records. This level of detail. Tony, how the hell did you get access to this kind of information? The same way I got access to these, I said, pulling out a second set of documents. Shipping manifests with falsified cargo descriptions. Bills of lading for containers that had never existed. Port Authority permits signed by officials who had been dead for 2 years. Don Castellano stood up so quickly, his chair fell backward. Those are federal documents. Classified federal documents. And these, I continued, ignoring his outburst and producing the surveillance photographs, are pictures of your Colombian businessmen meeting with DEA agents, FBI supervisors, and at least 3 people I recognize as CIA liaisons. The room erupted in chaos. Don Rossi was on his feet, shouting questions I wasn't ready to answer. Don Marconi was backing toward the door, clearly calculating his chances of surviving whatever revelation was coming. Don Torino sat frozen, staring at photographs that proved his Colombian problem was actually a federal sting operation. Enough! Don Benedetto's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Everyone sit down and shut up. Tony, you're going to explain exactly who you are and how you came by this information. I looked around the room at 5 men whose trust I had cultivated for 3 years, whose lives I had shared, whose problems had become my problems. Men who were about to learn that their loyal driver was someone else entirely. My name isn't Tony Marcelli, I said. It's David Phoenix. Until 3 years ago, I worked for a joint task force that doesn't officially exist, conducting operations that never happened for an agency that has no name. Federal agent, Don Rossi spat, his hand moving toward the gun under his jacket. I knew it. I knew there was something wrong about you. Not federal, I said quickly, noting that 3 other hands had also moved toward concealed weapons. Something else. Something that exists in the spaces between official agencies. CIA, asked Don Castellano, sometimes, when necessary. But primarily, we handle situations that require deniability and results that can't be achieved through official channels. Don Torino finally found his voice. 3 years. You've been lying to me for 3 years. I've been protecting you for 3 years, I corrected. The operation I was running when I came to Brooklyn went sideways. My cover was blown, my team was compromised, and powerful people wanted me dead. Working as your driver wasn't just a cover identity. It was witness protection. Witness to what? I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to tell them would change everything between us. Witness to a conspiracy that involves high-level government officials using organized crime as cover for operations that violate every law on the books. Your Colombian problem isn't about drugs or territory. It's about using your organization as a front for activities that would cause international incidents if they were traced back to official sources. The room fell silent again as 5 intelligent men processed the implications of what I had just told. Them, the raids on Carmine's operations, Don Benedetto said slowly. They weren't law enforcement. They were cleanup. Eliminating witnesses and evidence before the real operation goes live, I confirmed. The Colombians aren't trying to take over your territory. They're trying to eliminate you as players, so they can use your infrastructure without interference. And the federal investigation? Theater, designed to keep you focused on law enforcement, while the real threat moves into position. Don Torino set down the photographs, his face pale with the realization of how completely they had been outmaneuvered. What's the endgame, Phoenix? What do they actually want? Access to shipping routes, dock facilities, and trucking networks that can move material without the kind of scrutiny that official channels would receive. They want to use your organization's infrastructure to transport things that officially don't exist to places that officially aren't involved in whatever operation they're running. And us? Expendable. Once they have what they need, you'll all be arrested, killed, or discredited. The organization will be dismantled, your assets will be seized, and your people will be scattered. Don Rossi slammed his fist on the table. Then we fight. We eliminate the Colombians, we eliminate anyone working with them, and we send a message that nobody uses the 5 families without consequences. That's exactly what they want you to do, I said. Violence brings media attention, federal oversight, justification for heavy-handed law enforcement response. The moment you start shooting, you've lost. Then what do you suggest? Asked Don Benedetto. What would someone with your experience recommend? I pulled out the final document from the envelope, a detailed operational plan that had taken me 2 days to prepare and might get me killed by people on both sides of this conflict. I suggest we give them exactly what they want, but on our terms instead of theirs. Explain. We cooperate with the Colombian operation. We provide the infrastructure they need, the access they want, the cover they require. But we document everything. We record every meeting, photograph every shipment, track every financial transaction. And when their operation is complete, when they think they've won, we deliver everything we've collected to people who can use it to destroy not just the Colombians, but the government officials who authorize this entire operation. Don Castellano leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. Blackmail, mutually assured destruction, I corrected. They get their operation, we keep our organization, and everyone walks away with enough information to guarantee that nobody talks about what really happened. And if they refuse, if they try to eliminate us anyway, then we release everything immediately and let the resulting scandal destroy everyone involved. Don Benedetto studied my face with the intensity of a man who had spent decades reading people's intentions in their expressions. Phoenix, this plan requires trust. It requires us to believe that you're working for our interests instead of your own. It requires you to believe that after 3 years of driving Don Torino around Brooklyn, attending family dinners, and listening to stories about grandchildren, I've developed a vested interest in keeping you all alive. And have you? I thought about Sunday dinners at Don Torino's house, about his granddaughter teaching me to play checkers, about the strange sense of belonging I had found among people who should have been my enemies. Yes, I said simply, you've become my family. And I protect my family. Don Torino stood up slowly, walked around the table and stopped directly in front of me. For a moment I thought he was going to pull his gun and end 3 years of deception with a bullet to the head. Instead, he extended his hand. David Phoenix, he said, welcome to the family. Officially this time. As I shook hands with the man who had become more than my employer, I realized that sometimes the most important operations were the ones that saved the people you never expected to care about. The driver was gone. The agent was back. But the man who stood between them belonged to something he had never expected to find, a family worth dying for, and more importantly, worth living for. Outside, the storm was breaking, and through the cracked windows of the abandoned ballroom, the first rays of dawn painted the harbor in shades of gold and possibility. We had work to do.